Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Terrio from Ontario, Canada, and I want to thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's unfortunate we can't be together in person, but such is the circumstances with COVID-19. I hope you're all well and you're being as safe as you possibly can. And I'm pretty excited actually to talk to you about three topics, but this one is about XR, the future of EMS and learning. By XR, I'm referring to virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. But the focus of this talk is going to be on virtual reality um, for reasons that'll become clear as we go along. So just by way of background, let me just advance the slide here a second. So just by way of background, I've been a paramedic for 35 years. I've been teaching paramedics for the last 20 years, and about a year and a half ago, we integrated virtual reality into our paramedic lab for patient simulation, teaching empathy, and we started exploring online learning using virtual reality platforms. And at the same time, I was pushing to get virtual reality introduced into our library because I really felt it was important for students to experience virtual reality and give us feedback about what they thought of it and how effective a tool it was for learning. And as a result of some of my explorations, the president and vice president academic of our college invited me to a meeting to try to get some idea from me of where I thought virtual and augmented reality was going. And I told them that I felt it needed some leadership in order for it to reach a threshold level of interest. So they created a position, posted it, I applied for it and got it. And I'm on a 2-year secondment now to help programs integrate virtual reality into the curricula. So it's still really early days, and I think it's really important for educators to explore virtual reality, to see what sort of potential it has, but also to interact with companies and communicate to them the importance of sound pedagogy in VR, and talk about pricing as well, because it's so new. A lot of companies are not sure how to price their products. So some of the programs, I'm actually working with about 26 programs at the college right now to integrate VR, and some of them sort of on the forefront are our biotech degree, occupational therapy assistant and physiotherapy assistant program, massage, nursing, and a swath of healthcare. I'm also working with police studies and pre-service fire as well on virtual reality. So some really interesting things coming down. This is the hub in our library where students can book time and try some virtual reality for education. So unlike other educational technologies, virtual reality is different in the sense that it's fairly expensive. And so before adopting virtual reality into a curriculum, it's important to look at a number of things. And this is a sort of discussion I have with faculty. So when I think about pedagogy, I think about a few things. I think about, does the VR product that a program is exploring, does it address the cognitive, affective, or psychomotor domains, or a combination of those three? Does it meet Maslow's hierarchy of needs? So, for example, one of our needs are the students' needs is their psychological needs. So, for example, if I have a mass casualty incident VR application, putting my students into that application in their third or fourth week, probably not such a great idea without having some sort of stress inoculation training first, because I never know how it's going to affect them. I've been a paramedic a long time, and I go into a VR application like that, and I think, wow, this is cool. This is good learning. But a student who has no context, who's never seen a sick or injured patient, to see people who've been killed and who have, external hemorrhaging, I don't know how it's going to affect them. So those are the things we have to think about. I think about the learning objectives the VR product is hitting as well. If it only hits one or two learning objectives out of one course, out of many courses, is it worth the return on investment? When I think about software and what's the right software, a lot of VR applications now are single player. So only one person can go into the experience at a time and learn from it. It's more expensive to develop multiplayer virtual reality applications, but ideally for EMTs and paramedicine, that's the way to go, because you want at least 2 people in there, or 3 or more. It'd be nice if, as the instructor, I could be in there with my students to mentor them or to observe what they're doing. In terms of hardware, so immersive VR really came about in 2016 with the introduction of the Oculus Rift. And so prior to that, there were very few headsets that were of any decent quality. And in 2016, the high-end virtual reality headsets required a connection to a gaming computer. So you're looking at a gaming computer and a virtual reality headset. You're looking at $2,500 US on average, and that's fairly expensive. But more recently, we have standalone virtual reality headsets like the Oculus Quest. I have one right here, and let's see if you can see it there. There we go. And that doesn't require a connection to a computer. And from an educational standpoint, that's pretty important because the cost is lower and it means it's portable. The right space, so typically with virtual reality, if you're going to be moving about, if you've got 6 degrees of freedom, and I won't talk about the difference between 6 degrees and 3 degrees of freedom, but 6 degrees of freedom essentially means you can move around. It's quite freely. You need typically a 10 by 10 foot space or a 12 by 12 foot space, ideally. If your virtual reality experience just requires you to sit, then obviously space is not an issue. The pricing is a tricky one, and I think the more of us as educators who start to explore virtual reality and start to talk with companies and get on the same page, the better off we're going to be, because a lot of companies want to charge a price per student. And I've told numerous companies now, a cost per student is just not going to fly with Canadian colleges and universities. I don't know how it is in the United States, but here it's not going to fly for 2 reasons. We can't incorporate that fee into tuition because it's a moving target, and we might be looking at adopting several virtual reality software applications. We can't incorporate it as a student fee. We also have privacy laws that prevent us from sharing student information with companies. And thirdly, we might start in our program with 52 students and be down to 42 in week 3. Who's going to notify the company that those students have left? It's not going to be me as the instructor, and it's not going to be the registrar's office. So it just doesn't work. So what I've been telling companies is, you want to charge an upfront fee? Okay, if it's reasonable. If you want to charge a fee per headset, that probably works. Just not a fee per student. The return on investment, so the price for virtual reality applications varies widely, really widely, wildly actually. So there's some applications that are, $20, $30, $40, and it's a one-time fee. There's some that are an annual fee, and the annual fee can range from $100 to $30,000, $40,000, $60,000 per year. It just depends on how complex the application is. So you have to look seriously at, is it worth the return on investment? Are the students, is it hitting on a number of learning objectives, or is it hitting a pain point? So for example, a virtual reality experience that is a multi-casualty incident is pretty valuable to me because it takes weeks, sometimes months, to set up a mock disaster and do the moulaging and get people prepared and maybe involve actors and set up the scene. But if I can do a virtual reality, and if I can do it for, say $150 a year per headset, that's pretty reasonable. Now, you could still do mock disasters, but you know that your students are much better prepared for triaging at an MCI if they've done it in VR first. A little bit of terminology I should get out of the way. So three things: presence, embodiment, and agency. And there's lots, like everything, there's lots and lots of terminology in this field. But I want to talk about these three things. So presence is the illusion of being somewhere while knowing that you're not. So the first time you experience virtual reality in a high-end headset, it's pretty mind-blowing if you happen to get put in a good experience. At least that was my experience. You feel like you're in another world. You walk around in it, you see things. If there's an animated character, you can walk up to them, you can walk around them, you can move to other places. It's pretty amazing. And psychologists have studied this quite extensively. Jeremy Bailenson, who's the director for the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford University, has looked at this. And one of the VR experiences that they put people through is called the plank. And the plank is a VR experience where you put on the headset and you find yourself 30 floors above the cityscape, and you're standing on a wooden plank looking down, and there's nothing beside you, nothing in front of you. And very quickly, if you're at all nervous about heights, you start to feel like you're going to lose your balance and you feel like you're going to fall. That's a sense of presence. Now, I wouldn't recommend that experience for everyone, but that's a feeling like you're in a different world. So you've got, a little bit of conflict between your rational brain saying this is not real and another part of your brain saying, man, this feels real. So it's, that suspended disbelief that we try to achieve with high fidelity simulators, not dissimilar, only you're talking about being in an entirely different world. Embodiment is acknowledging the existence of your body in the virtual reality world. Now, it's not your body, obviously, it's an avatar. And what that avatar looks like can affect your self-perception, which is really intriguing. And there's been a lot of research done on this, and I'm going to talk about this when I talk about empathy apps. So we'll just leave it at that for now, but just remember that when you look different as an avatar, you feel different. Agency is the other term I want to talk about. So it's the capacity to act and influence an artificial environment. So local agency is where you can do things, for example, with your hands. So you can pick up things, you can move them, you can throw them, you can, turn knobs, and you can make things happen in there. Global agency is where you can do things and it changes the outcome. So for example, in virtual reality, if I take a set of vital signs and I interpret the ECG monitor and I start an intravenous line and I administer a medication and that medication changes the vital signs for the better, that's global agency. That affects the outcome, and that could be really interesting. So in terms of XR, and the focus again is on virtual reality, we've sort of looked at, or what I'm looking at with various programs, including our paramedic program, is online learning, using VR for empathy and for simulation. And then at the end, I'll talk about the metaverse. So let's talk about empathy first. So Jeremy Bailenson, who I mentioned earlier, he made the statement in one of his books that VR creates experiences, and experiences cause empathy, that it changes our perception. And this is truly a fascinating area in research, and this has been backed up by the research. So if you can experience what it's like to have Alzheimer's, or what it's like to be on the autism spectrum and experience that hypersensitivity to sounds and lights, and to experience synesthesia, that's much more powerful than me and my students having a discussion about Alzheimer's and autism. There's a program by Stanford University. It's called Becoming Homeless, a VR experience. It's free. It's 9 minutes long, and it's really compelling. So you put on the VR headset, and you find yourself in your apartment, and you've recently lost your job, and you get an eviction notice that's sitting in front of you. And the narrator tells you that you're going to have to sell some items in your apartment in order to pay the rent. So you start pointing and clicking at different items in your apartment, And in the end, you still don't have enough money to pay the rent, so you get evicted. Then you find yourself in your car, and your belongings are in the back seat and beside you, and there's, food wrappers on the dashboard, and you're trying to sleep in your car, and you've got several parking tickets, and the police pull up, and because you've been unable to pay your parking tickets, they impound your car. Now you find yourself in a public transit on a city bus at night, because that city where you live happens to have a program that allows the homeless to sleep on the buses at night. And you're sitting on the bus, and there's 3 or 4 people on the bus, and the narrator tells you that there's a guy on the bus who likes to harass the homeless and will steal your backpack if you're not careful. So the narrator tells you if he approaches you, just look up and stare at him, and he'll walk away. So he comes up to you, and you look up and you stare at him, and you keep staring at him, and eventually he walks away. And in the end, you can point and click on the different characters on the bus and find out how they became homeless. And for me, it was a really profound experience. When I took the headset off, it was that same experience I've had in the past where I've been to a really, really thought-provoking movie, and you come out of the theater and you're so deeply immersed in your thoughts that you really don't want to talk to anyone. You just want to process what you've just seen, and becoming homeless was that kind of experience for me. Equal reality is one that we're looking at right now. And this is one where your avatar becomes a person of color or another ethnicity, and you get to experience what it's like to be the victim of microaggressions, cultural aggressions. And no amount of class discussion can change your perception the way actually experiencing it does. And we know this is fairly effective from the research, and Stanford University has a repository of all the research in this area. And there are a number of programs coming out of the market now, virtual reality experiences that enable you to experience sexism, sexual harassment, racism, and so on. Really, really intriguing and compelling, and I'm really excited to see where this is going to go moving forward, not just for education for healthcare providers like EMTs and paramedics, but also, in business. So online learning is another area that I'm really interested with virtual reality. There are a number of spatial networks. Some people call them social VR platforms. But spatial networks is a broader term that encompasses both virtual reality and webcasting platforms like Zoom and WebEx and Google Hangouts. Social VR is a term that doesn't translate well into other languages. And spatial networks, I'll refer to these as immersive spatial networks, for virtual reality for online. What's really interesting about these platforms, and these are a couple, so the one you're looking at the top left is called AltSpace VR. It's a Microsoft product. The one on the bottom right is called Engage, and they're out of Ireland. And what's really interesting in immersive spatial networks is you feel presence. You feel like you're there. So the first seminar I ever went to was a kind of a panel discussion, and there were 3 people up on stage discussing something, and there was an audience, and we were all seated close by. The first time I went in there, I sat a little too close to someone by mistake, and I turned to them and said sorry and moved over, because Americans say excuse me, Canadians say sorry, just so you know. And so I moved over a couple of inches virtually. It was that same awkward feeling that you get when you get a little too close to someone in real life, which was really incredible. The other thing that's really interesting about virtual reality as a platform for online learning is when you're talking to someone face to face with another mannequin, not a mannequin, an avatar, even if they look cartoonish, you feel like you're there with that person having a conversation with them. It's incredible. And if you talk at the same volume like I'm talking right now, and move away, fairly soon they can no longer hear you. So that's the spatial audio that we experience in virtual reality. So that means that you could go to a session, and then you can break out into groups, and the groups can go off in a distance and have conversations, and their voices don't bleed over into the other groups. So that's pretty incredible. In terms of embodiment, what kind of avatar you have, uh, there are arguments in favor of cartoonish avatars versus more realistic avatars. There are different reasons for different avatars. So in AltSpace VR, the avatars are all pretty generic. They're all the exact same height. There's sort of male, female, and on the gender spectrum as well. And then there's robots that are non-specific. But we all pretty much look alike. And in some ways that democratizes things. We don't, sort of tend to gravitate towards avatars that have a particular appearance. We just sort of mingle around with everyone, which is really amazing, because you might find yourself speaking to someone who's in a wheelchair and you have no idea in their wheelchair. And I've heard disabled people say that they absolutely love the freedom of being an avatar because nobody knows they're disabled. Now you and I, we're healthcare providers. I'm very comfortable speaking to a stranger I've never met who's in a wheelchair, because it's been my whole life. But a lot of people are uncomfortable with that, and avatars sort of democratize things. Engage VR, they have a different approach. You can, if you have a pro account, you create your avatar and you type in your height and your weight, and you can actually use a photo of your face to create your avatar's face. But if you're just a participant, your avatar is just your face and your upper body. So it's just a torso with hands. And some people prefer that you look the way your avatar looks the way you look, so they have some idea of what your face looks like. But anyway. And agency really depends on the platform. So in some immersive spatial networks, you're able to do things like pick things up and move things around, and that's going to be important moving forward, so that it's not only a place where you can listen to lectures and do group work, but you can actually do things with your hands. That'll be important moving forward. So this is AltSpace VR, and before I play this video, I'll just give you a little bit of background. So our students, our second year students, did some applied research work, and one group of 4 students did an applied research project comparing patient simulation in the lab with a student volunteering as a patient compared to patient simulation in virtual reality. And it was just a small study, proof of concept, not a big enough cohort to look at publishing it, but to see if students assessed, treated, made decisions in roughly the same sequence in virtual reality compared to analog. And they found those about an 80% similarity, which to me says that if they can assess patients in virtual reality and make decisions in a similar manner, that this might supplement their lab learning. So if they can practice over and over again in virtual reality, hopefully it'll improve performance in the lab. But that's another study to come in the future. So let me just play. This is two of the students. All 4 of them weren't able to make it, but 2 of the students presented their research at the 2020 International VR Symposium in AltSpace VR, where there were 170 speakers and roughly 6,000 attendees. It was pretty incredible. So that little guy in the green, that's me, believe it or not, and those 2 female avatars in the middle of the stage, those are my students. So let me just play a clip of this video.
So I just wanted to explain what lab-based scenarios encompasses. Basically what we mean by that is we go into a lab where we simulate a patient condition or a situation. We use mannequins for this, or we use actors, and we use usually equipment similar to what we would use on the road, and sometimes replica. So that's what we mean by lab-based. So Andrew's just going to talk to you a little bit about the method.
Okay, so the method to our studies. So we randomly selected 10 second-year Georgian College paramedic students to participate and volunteer in our study.
So that just gives you a glimpse into how a presentation might appear in AltSpace VR. So this is a group within AltSpace called Educators in VR, and there is a Facebook page called Educators in VR, and you're welcome to join. Just make sure you answer the questions when you join. And let me just move on to the next slide here. So this is a conference exhibit in virtual reality. This is the platform called Engage I talked about earlier. And what I find remarkable about this is one, that you can have exhibitors in virtual reality, which is pretty incredible, and they can show their products. Now, this has nothing to do with medicine, but what's particularly cool, at the end of this clip, you're looking at this industrial dump truck, and the guy who's manning the booth can actually bring in the dump truck or a digital version of the dump truck into the conference space, and it's to scale, essentially. Compared to the size of the avatars, the dump truck is scale size. So let's have a look.
Hi, Kirsty, is it?
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. I'm David, and I represent Dacia Heavy Industries. Are you interested in the EN 500 model?
Yeah, I work for a northern mining company. This is exactly the type of thing we're looking into.
Oh, well, fantastic. I think the EN 500 really is the latest in dump truck technology. It can carry a load of 500 cubic meters, and it has the latest security and safety devices built into it. For example, we've got front and rear LiDAR systems, which can scan and anticipate collisions, and we also have independent traction sensing. This helps to avoid slippage, sliding, or any other problems that can occur in a mine. It also has front and rear independent power plants. They're driven by diesel engines, but they also have hybrid technology built into the design. And this means that we can provide independent traction to each wheel. And not only that, it's also very fuel efficient. So this is actually the most fuel efficient truck on the market.
It's very impressive. Is there any way we could see it bigger?
Oh, absolutely. Because we're in VR, I can show you the exact size. Let me see, here we go. I'll just bring up my menu. And there we go. This is the exact model. Yeah. Do you want to jump over there and we'll have a look at it?
Yeah.
So, our model's been on the market for a year, and so far we've had great feedback from customers. They've been able to demonstrate.
So, pretty impressive. At least I'm really impressed by that kind of example. You may have heard, because of COVID-19, a lot of big conferences have moved online, and some of them have moved into virtual VR. Or virtual reality, rather. So HTC, for example, the maker of phones, one of the world's largest maker of cell phones, had their developer conference in virtual reality. They have something like 3,000 attendees, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. So let's talk about simulation before we wrap up. And simulation is really interesting to me because right now with COVID-19, we've all scrambled to move our lessons, theory lessons, online using webcasting platforms and using screencasts. But what do you do about the hands-on component? How do you replace that? And most people would say we can't. And I would tend to agree with that, with a caveat. I would say that virtual reality may be a way of students being able to practice discrete skills and scenarios in a realistic enough environment, virtual reality, that it shortens the learning curve significant. And when they come back to the hands-on component, they're much better prepared and much more likely to perform better than they would have without any face-to-face time at all. So I say that with confidence, but there's still research that needs to be done around that to quantify that statement. So let's look at anatomy and virtual reality, for example. So this is a product that is available on PC or tablet, but also available in virtual reality. And students can go into this anatomy program in VR on their own or with a teacher. So it's a spatial network where a teacher can meet with students in an anatomy lab and run classes. And this has something called local agency, meaning you can point at bones of body parts and it labels them. You can pull them off and look at the insertion points, and it'll quiz you as well. So you're not just looking at things and pointing at things, but it'll quiz you as well. So there's local agency. At the end, I put lower order thinking, but anatomy is really aimed at knowledge and comprehension. There isn't a lot of higher order thinking in anatomy until we get into physiology and pathophysiology. But let's have a look at this video. I'm going to pause it there because I think we've seen enough, but there are a number of body systems you can look at. As I said, the instructor can meet with the students inside the lab. You're looking at sort of a lab classroom. You can change the environment in there. One of our nursing faculty who teaches anatomy has submitted a proposal to acquire 45 headsets to bring his students into virtual reality for anatomy for next year. So I'm hoping, I don't know if it'll happen in September 2020 given our current situation, but hopefully that'll happen in the not too distant future. The British Columbia Institute for Technology, BCIT, in Vancouver, British Columbia, has been using this program with their medical imaging students, and their plan this fall was to randomize students to anatomy in a classroom versus anatomy in virtual reality to see if there was any difference in performance between the two groups of students. So that should be really interesting. Medical simulation. So medical simulation ranges from things with local agency where you're doing a lot of things with your hands to global agency where you're making decisions but maybe not doing as much with your hands. In my mind, the ideal simulation is one where you have both local agency and you can do lots of things with your hands and it actually affects the outcome. This is a simulation where it's a single player, and the shortcoming to this, and you'll see this in a few programs, but hopefully it'll change over the next 3 to 5 years. The shortcoming to this is that when you want to interact with the patient, if you want to ask the patient questions, you have to choose from a drop-down list. If you want to assess vital signs, instead of pulling the pulse oximeter out of the kit and then the blood pressure cuff and then the ECG leads, you have to just point at a series of texts and say, take a blood pressure, count respirations, check for a pulse, put a pulse oximeter on, and so on. And that's weak pedagogy. On the other hand, you're making decisions, you're choosing what treatments, and ultimately it affects the outcome, good or bad, depending on whether you assessed and treated the patient appropriately, and that's a good thing. So it addresses higher order thinking. But the future is going to be two things. One, I sort of think of virtual reality for simulation in two categories. One, VR that addresses discrete skills, where you're doing things with your hands, steps in a procedure over and over again, and you develop that embodied cognition or muscle memory, which is truly fantastic. And then another set of VR simulations where you're going through a whole scenario. And local agency may vary, but global agency is a big part of it, where you're making decisions in terms of treatment interventions that affect the patient's outcome. So the one on the left is a nursing simulation where, and they have a series of nursing simulation. I'll just give an example. So one is insulin administration, where you go into a patient's room, you introduce yourself to the patient, and you go to the sink and wash your hands, and it actually times you washing your hands for 20 seconds, which is truly cool. And you got to wash, all sides of your hands, if you will, which is really amazing. And then you go to the stock cupboard and you get the supplies that you need. You bring them out, you put them on a table, and then you assemble your IV bag with your IV administration set, and then you go to the patient again and look at their armband and make sure that's the right patient, and so on. So, to be able to practice those procedures over and over again shortens the time in which it takes you to do them, and gives you a greater accuracy. Now, there was a study published in 2020, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but I'll give you the rough numbers. This was orthopedic surgical students residents who practiced a procedure that involved tibial nailing, and there was a series of steps involved in this procedure, and a list of equipment required for it, and the students were randomized to either lab only practice versus lab supplemented by virtual reality. And the students who were in the group of lab supplemented by virtual reality had a 68% accuracy rate, compared with the students who are just in the lab had about a 22% accuracy rate. And the VR group were able to get through the procedure in 15 minutes versus 45 minutes for the lab only group. And their time was comparable to seasoned surgeons. So you think about, surgical procedures that are infrequent procedures. If you were able to do them in virtual reality, that would be incredibly helpful. Just like in EMS, we often throw our students into high risk, low frequency type calls. We're running everyone experiences seizure, coma, death. So VR is a good place to do that. Let me go back here. Sorry. So I'm going to play this video. This is by a company called SimX, and it has some local agency and some global agency. So you're able to do things with your hands, and you're able to make interventions and make a difference. You see the animated character on the left. These are two. I'm not sure if they're physician residents or nurses. I think they might be nursing students, and they've got the VR headsets on and backpacks on the right hand side there. And the only thing I don't like about this is there are spots where you're supposed to auscultate on the chest, and in real life there are no spots. So I told the company you should take away those spots. I should also just mention too, one of the physicians who co-founded the company, Dr. Tyler Andre, I met with him in virtual reality about a year and a half ago, and he ran me through 4 resuscitations where he controlled the patient's parameters on a laptop computer, and I did everything else. It was very cool. Here I am in Canada, central Canada, and he was on the west coast of the United States, and we were doing this thing together. It's really amazing. Anyway, let's take a look at the video.
Looks like we have a man down.
Yeah, I see the Humvee on fire over there too, but I don't hear any gunfire or anything.
What happened over here?
We were out on patrol and there was an explosion that flipped the Humvee. I cleared the area and I think we're safe. Must have been an old IED.
Are you hurt?
I'm alright, but Washington hit the ground pretty hard.
Okay. Hey, soldier, what's your name?
I'm Alex Washington.
Okay. Well, patient's phonating, airway repairs clear. Hey, Alex, we're going to do a quick exam and try to get you feeling better, okay?
Okay.
Okay, let me get him disrobed. Okay, I've got bilateral breath sounds.
I'll pause it there, but essentially he's got a pneumothorax. He's got diminished air entry on the right side and good air entry on the left side, which the participants noticed and verbalized a few seconds later. But I don't know if you noticed the avatars, but the avatar was basically just a head with some hands. And when you've got global agency, it may not be as important to have a full body torso. But Anyway, this is a great simulation that combines both local agency and global agency, and really helps you fine-tune your critical thinking. But what's particularly mind-blowing and super cool to me in virtual reality is that you're in a different world. So I think about my first-year students or my first semester students, and I talk about cases, and I can visualize those cases in my head. But they have no context. They haven't seen critically ill or injured patients. So, when I'm describing someone who's dyspneic, they really have no idea what that means. So I'm describing it and describing what the terminology means sort of simultaneously. But if they could see it in their first semester, see these patients and see what they look like when they're leaning forward and they're struggling to breathe, and, they actually they're able to auscultate the chest and identify adventitious lung sounds and recognize that this patient is only able to speak 5 words between taking breaths. If they could walk over to the night table and pick up their medication and see what they're on, to me, that's extraordinarily powerful. So this is another simulation by a company called Health Scholars, and they have advanced cardiac life support and pediatric advanced life support scenarios. And what's interesting in these is there's almost no agency, so you don't do anything with your hands. You can see a medical resident standing with a headset, and all the avatars are medical personnel around this resuscitation. But it uses voice recognition and artificial intelligence for you to run the code. It could be a patient in a stable rhythm or a symptomatic rhythm, or they could be in a cardiac arrest rhythm, and every avatar has a name tag. And you just call out to them, and you'll say something like, Aaron, can you start an intravenous line, please? Fatima, can you give 1 milligram of epinephrine? So let me just play the video for this.
Doesn't require expensive equipment, people resources.
Wait a minute here. Let me just go back to the beginning. All right, here we go.
You're with a stable patient when he starts to have a cardiopulmonary emergency. Your code team is off dealing with another emergency. It's clear there's little time to help this patient.
Code blue, room 8. And make sure some normal...
It's been 10 months since your last ACLS certification. You're racking your brain trying to remember the right algorithms, but you can't. Sound familiar? It does to your clinical staff. ACLS competency decays within months after certification for those who work in non-critical care areas. With today's in-hospital cardiac arrest survival rates of 11 to 35%, it's clear that we can do better. So, how can you implement high-impact refresher training across your entire system? Training that doesn't require expensive equipment, people resources, or time-consuming setup? Enter virtual reality. Health Scholars' new ACLS virtual reality simulation training virtualizes stable, unstable, and cardiac arrest scenarios, effectively recreating the stress of a megacode.
Mr. Nelson is a 56-year-old man who's here for a PICC line.
The learner takes on the role of team lead, identifying different cardiac waveforms and using state-of-the-art voice recognition technology to direct virtual team members.
Andre, start chest compressions.
Starting compressions.
Okay, so I think it's enough of the video to give you a good sense of what that's like. And when I look at a virtual reality experience like this, I think, wow, my students who are now at home, they can't be in the lab because of COVID-19, if they had VR headsets and could practice ACLS and PAL scenarios on their own, what a difference that would make when we finally get back together again in the lab. So I find this really, really compelling. This is another one that's similar, only there's no agency. You don't do anything with your hands, but it's purely for patient communication simulations. So you go into a hospital room and you encounter a patient, you're able to look at her chart, and then you have a conversation with her. So it uses voice recognition and artificial intelligence, and I'll say, "Hi Valerie, my name is Rob, I'm a paramedic student. I understand you're having a headache today." And she'll say, "Yes, it's really awful." And I'll say, "When did your headache start?" "It started about 4 days ago, but I woke up this morning and it was much worse." And on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the worst pain imaginable, how would you rate your pain? "Oh, I'd say it's about probably a 7 out of 10. It's really bad. And then I can go on to ask about medical history, medications, allergies, where is a headache located, does it go anywhere, how would she describe it, has she taken any medication for it, and so on. So you know and I know that students, one of the weak areas for a lot of students, EMTs and paramedic students, is eliciting a good history and a consistent history. And imagine being able to take a VR headset home with you and practice these histories over and over and over again. And what these software applications typically do is they create a script of everything you said and the client said or the patient said, and provide a printout for that and identify what elements of the history you missed. So you get that feedback and you can practice over and over again. This kind of thing is very exciting to me, especially when it comes to things like de-escalating someone who's very aggressive or hostile or agitated, dealing with someone who's on the autism spectrum and is having a bit of a meltdown outside. The soft skills are really, really interesting in virtual reality. So I've taken up quite a bit of your time, and I'm going to take some questions live when we meet sort of virtually face-to-face. But in summary, the areas that are most interesting and compelling to me in virtual reality are teaching online, teaching empathy, and simulation, both discrete skills and scenario type simulations. The future of XR, virtual realities more specifically, is really interesting. So always important to think about pedagogy before adopting a technology. Does it meet the needs that you're trying to address? Is it something that would otherwise be dangerous or impossible or counterproductive or expensive? The mnemonic for that is DICE, and that comes from Jeremy Balinson from the Virtual Human Interactive Lab at Stanford. Is there a sense of presence? Is there a level of realism? Because in certain scenarios you need that realism to feel like you're actually dealing with a patient who's sick or injured. For empathy, do you have that sense of embodiment? So I didn't mention this earlier, but they call that the Proteus effect, when you feel like you're different based on your avatar. So it's not unlike, that expression, when you look good, you feel good, or when I go into a shopping mall as Rob Terrio, civilian, I feel like just a regular guy shopping. But when I go in with my partner and we're in uniform, we have a stretcher, I feel like a person of authority. I feel like a professional, and I have a different perception of myself. That's the Proteus effect. And you can change that with embodiment as an avatar. If you're an avatar that's elderly or on the autism spectrum, it changes your perception of self. And agency, again, really important for learning, especially muscle memory type experiences. So voice recognition, physical interaction, artificial intelligence are going to be really important components of virtual reality in medicine going forward. I'm really excited to see what's going to happen in those areas. And up and coming areas, so I should say analytics are already there. A lot of programs use analytics, so they analyze everything you did and provide you with feedback. Haptics and biometrics is a fairly newer area. So haptics means the ability to feel things. So if you're reaching down to feel a radial pulse with your controller, you can actually feel your controller vibrate. That's really crude, basic haptics, but it's powerful just the same. You can, if you're triaging a mass casualty incident and you reach down for a radial pulse and you feel it, you can actually, get an immediate sense of whether this patient's tachycardic or bradycardic, or has a weak pulse, strong pulse. But haptic gloves exist right now. They're getting better all the time. They're going to continue to get better. Biometrics is really interesting. So looking at things like your pulse rate, your respiratory rates, your pupillary size changes, and eye tracking is really interesting. Privacy issues aside, because that's a big problem. But if I'm having my students learn how to drive an ambulance in virtual reality, it'd be nice to track their eyes to test their evaluate their situational awareness. Do they notice the car backing out of the driveway? Do they notice a pedestrian walking between the cars? If they're a about to crash their ambulance, where are they looking? Because instinctively we look at the crash to try to avoid it. But driver training requires that you train them to look where they want to go instead of looking at the crash. So you could actually quantify that with eye tracking, which is really interesting. And the other biometrics will be valuable going forward when we want to measure stress levels and do stress inoculation to see if we can teach paramedics how to keep their stress under control in life and death situations. In the end, well, I shouldn't say the end. There's really no end, but in the near future, within the next year to 5 years, I'm really hoping to see more of a metaverse concept. And what I mean by that is, there are virtual reality apps that enable you to do patient procedures and full out scenarios. But what I'd love to see is those kinds of applications brought into an immersive spatial network, so that I can meet my students in a virtual environment, and my students can go off and do EMS calls. I can hop into the back of the ambulance with one of them, go off to a call, and follow them into the house and just sort of observe what they're doing, and then do a debriefing afterwards, maybe nudge them a little bit to, did you ask the patient about this? That's the metaverse, when you combine experiences in a social environment. That's really, really exciting to see coming down the road. So I want to say thank you for inviting me here. I've taken up almost an hour, and you can reach me at paramedic_tutor on Twitter, or at edtechmedic on Twitter as well. And I look forward to taking your questions.